Okay, now we're going to start Chapter 4, defining the project. And this has several pieces. First, let's look at what's called the scope statement. So here's what we're going to cover in Chapter 4. Step 1, defining the scope. So this lecture and priorities. Then we'll get into what's called the work breakdown structure. How do we assign responsibilities, and how do we communicate our plan? These are all part of planning or initiating the project. So, defining the project scope. Scope is a definition of the end result or mission of the project, a product or service. It's in specific, tangible, and measurable terms. Okay, we'll talk some more about that. So, the purpose of the scope statement is to clearly define the deliverables. What is it that the customer is expecting delivered? And that may be usually a product, but it might be training manuals. It might be supplies that go with that product. It might be many other things that go with it. What is the definition of the project? We want to be able to focus on successful completion of those goals. And this is used by everybody as a planning tool and a measuring tool. You're going to see we're going to set up this project so that we understand its flow and we can measure to its flow. That's where we're heading. So, importance of scope definition. Poorly defined scopes is one of the most frequent reasons projects fail. That scope is not set up clear and concise that everybody understands what is it that they need to deliver to be successful. So we want to do that. We want to provide focus through the life cycle of the project. And you as the project manager are responsible for assuring that the customer's objectives, deliverables, and requirements are met. Okay, so we're going to set up these objectives, deliverables, and requirements in this scope definition. So what do we usually put in a scope definition? And again, you might have a little difference in each of your companies, but it's going to be something like this. What's the objective of the project? What are the deliverables? You need to make these specific. Again, like I said, it may be the product, but it may be supplies with the product, training manuals, video, whatever. What are the deliverables? What are the milestones? What are we going to measure? This is key for longer projects. If you've got a 3-month project, it may not be so important. But for long projects, what are the milestones along the way? What are the requirements? We'll talk about that. What are the limits and exclusions? What are you not doing? This does not include this, this, and this. And then are you scheduling reviews with your customer? Again, for longer projects, what is the reviews with the customer? Okay, again, small project, maybe you don't care. But generally speaking, you're going to have a series of reviews. What are those specific reviews? So, deliverables. We're going to go through these. So deliverables, tangible good or service produced as a result of the project that is intended to be delivered. And remember, delivering can be internal or external. Your part of the project may be delivering something internally to another team that is going to deliver the end product. So you may have internal deliverables. In technical projects, which is what we're talking about, it's typically hardware, software, design documents, things like that. But many contracts will have very specific things, and they'll usually might call them something like this: Contract Data Requirements List, CDRL. What is the specific contracts? What data are they specifically required, or that's mentioned in the statement of work? Okay. And I'm going to talk statement of work versus scope coming up, because that can be a little misleading to again, depending on where you're at. Milestones. So this was deliverables. And we're going to go through some examples. Milestones now is a reference point. It has no duration, but marks an important event. So, delivery of an internal product. Okay? That was a deliverable. A milestone might be delivery of that product. I want to measure that milestone. Did you meet it or did you not meet it? You said you were going to deliver it at this point. Did you deliver it? In addition to helping the project team members stay informed, it also determines many times payments. So you might set up your payment schedule that you have internal milestones and then you're making payments on those. Again, this is for a longer term project, but maybe you're getting some milestones. Many of us might even have that contracting in our house. You know, you give the contractor so much up front. When they deliver, I'm redoing the kitchen maybe, let's say. When they deliver the cabinets, I'm giving them another payment. When they finish the project, I'm giving them a final payment. So maybe part of that. Most milestones, most, not all, are aligned with the critical path. Now, we're going to talk critical path not until chapter 6, but basically the critical path is, just as it sounds, if you don't meet that path, your project's not going to come in on schedule. It's critical. So, but we'll get into that in more detail, but milestones are generally linked to that critical path. Okay? Project requirements. What are the requirements? Usually these are partitioned into top-level requirements, sometimes referred to as functional. I never quite liked this functional and non-functional, but top-level are your functional. What's the function of this product? Technical requirements sometimes are then referred to as non-functional requirements. To me, the technical requirement, though, is how well does it have to work? So I'm delivering some piece of equipment that has to do a certain function. This is going to say how well it has to do it. Okay? So functional requirements define what a system is supposed to accomplish, and we talked a little bit about this in the review in the very first week. Non-functional pertain to the technical aspects. Usually, you're at least doing these functional requirements in your scope statement. What is the function of the product that has to be delivered? You may then negotiate those technical requirements later on. Okay, project scope statement versus statement of work. This can be confusing and unfortunately used interchangeably sometimes. Depending on your company. But let's talk typical definitions and what the PMBOK is kind of looking for. So statement of work, or you'll see SOW, contains the high-level scope. What's the scope of the project? High-level information on deliverables and so forth. Let me jump to the bottom. SOWs are generally prepared by the customer. So they're kind of telling you, this is the scope of what I want. These are the main deliverables of what I want. Then you as the company typically define a scope statement, so it's a lower level, more detailed description of the scope. So you're going to take what they're kind of sending you and detail it out a little bit more in your scope statement. More details on the deliverables, assumptions, constraints. Okay, customer, you're asking for this, but I'm expecting this from you, or these are the different constraints, things like that. So the scope statement's usually taken at a level down, but you might hear these interchangeably sometimes in different organizations. Okay, you also may hear project charter, and that could contain an expanded version of the scope, and it's usually kind of authorizing the project manager to initiate. So I'm going to sign off your scope statement, give you the charter to start this project. We're not going to talk that very much in here, but you might hear that in general out there. I have not heard it very often. So statement of work, first ideas for the project, charter, formally authorizing the project. So many times statement of work, business case, and then the scope statement, when the project manager is collecting requirements and defining the scope. We're defining the scope of this project. Got to be aware of scope creep. We're going to talk this several times during here. What you have to be really careful of is you're going to define the scope up front. Okay, this is the scope of my project. Watch out for customers changing that scope creep. And that's what we call scope creep. You and I might do that in our house. Oh, I love the cabinets you're putting in and you're doing this and that. How about if you add this and do that and do that? You've just given your contractor scope creep. Okay, so then they're going to probably come back and say, no problem, here's your dollars up more than it's going to cost. As a negotiating point, you may not charge for every scope creep thing, because then you may ask for some trade-offs with the customer. And again, we'll talk some of that later on, but be careful on scope creep. Okay, let's establish the priorities for the project. So this is important. You're up front, and what are the priorities? And again, you're going to see here that these could change depending on the project. So shifts in the relative importance of criteria related to cost, time, and performance. So what is more important to the customer? Is it cost? Is it time? Is it scope? They really want this thing to do exactly what you're saying. They're a little flexible on scope, or they may be a little flexible on cost. Maybe not. Maybe, look, cost and schedule are the most important thing. So you really have to understand the constraints. Lots of times they're going to tell you, yeah, they're all important. Okay? So you have to manage those things. And you might call them now as what we call is constrain, enhance, or accept. So constrain is it's a fixed requirement. I cannot slip schedule. Maybe you're providing a payload for a rocket that's being launched by SpaceX, and their launch date is such and such. You cannot change the schedule. So you have to get them something on that schedule. Okay? They might accept a little less performance, might not be happy, but accept a little less performance, but you have to meet that schedule. Or maybe cost is constrained. Enhance, you might have a chance of optimizing certain things on that. So they might say, yeah, let's talk about scope and so forth, but we can maybe optimize. Are they willing to accept, reduce, or not meet certain criteria? And again, generally speaking, they're going to come in and say all three of these. But what is the real limits? So lots of times we've got these, and again, I like to add that fourth one, quality. You're going to have to determine where that balance is. But generally speaking, up front, you may put together something like this. Look, I am constrained on performance. This absolutely has to meet this performance. It might be nice, they really would like it if they got it sooner. And they might accept some cost increase. You might know they could accept a little bit of cost increase because they really want this performance. Where does it fit? Each project's going to be a little different. They might tell you they're constrained on all three, but you're going to have to balance. But generally speaking, it's not. You can probably figure some constraints across the board. So now you have to do your scope statement. What are your constraints on doing your scope statement? Once you have your scope statement, we can now start breaking the project down in more detail, and let's do that next.